Hi friends, I am Professor Kshitij Bansal. I teach law at Jindal Global Law School. Let us today discuss the rights of sexual minorities. What will you be understanding after listening to this briefing? This module will introduce you to various international instruments which talk about the rights of sexual minorities. You would specifically learn about the instruments UN Charter 1945, UDHR 1948, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights 1966, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights 1966, Human Rights and Sexual Orientation 2003, Human Rights Council Resolution, the Yogyakarta Principles 2006, UN Declaration on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity 2008, Declaration of Sexual Rights 2014, Report of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Discrimination and Violence against Individuals based on their Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity 2015. The international human rights law includes instruments like the UN Charter, UDHR, two international covenants I just named, and a number of other treaties and non-binding instruments adopted by various UN bodies. However, these documents do not address the rights of sexual minorities directly, but through interpretations of UN bodies. The sexual minorities are also brought under the purview of these international human rights instruments. It is to be noted here that though non-binding, there are two important human rights instruments which address the rights of sexual minorities directly. They are Yogyakarta Principles of 2006 and the UN Declaration on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity 2008. Let us begin with the UN Charter 1945. The UN Charter creates legal obligations for member states and mandates the UN to formulate principles of international human rights law. The Charter expressly states that member states grant fundamental human rights and equality to all individuals. The preamble to the Charter states that none of the goals of the United Nations is to not reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women. It is to affirm all of this. The preamble also states that the UN will establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. Further, Article 1 of the Charter provides that one of the goals of the United Nations is to promote and encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Similarly, Article 55 of the Charter states that the United Nations shall promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Thus, it can be seen that UN Charter expressly prohibits any discrimination on the basis of sex. The supporters of sexual minorities' rights argue that the word sex includes sexual orientation and thereby sexual minorities. It can be seen, therefore, that the UN Charter is capable of providing human rights protections for sexual minorities. This way of interpretation gained its support from the working of UN in recent decades. For example, Human Rights Committee has stated the word sex so as to include sexual orientation. Thus, it can be argued that the UN Charter prohibits any discrimination on the basis of gender, thereby recognizing the rights of sexual minorities as well. In the absence of explicit enactments relating to the rights of LGBT individuals, the provisions in the Charter can be utilized to recognize sexual minorities under the term sex. UDHR 1948, which we know as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, expressly states that all human beings are entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. It also guarantees equal protection for all individuals with regards to all rights included in the Declaration. The support of rights of sexual minorities argue that since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights explicitly provides protection to individuals of other status, the Declaration affords protections to sexual minorities. Further, they point out that almost every clause in the Declaration begins with the word everyone, conferring positive rights on all human beings, including sexual minorities. This interpretation finds support in the past UN conferences where the term other status has been interpreted to include sexual minorities. For example, the Global Plan of Action with respect to housing, 1996, the UN incorporated the term other status to ensure that sexual minorities would have equal access to shelter and basic services. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966, guarantees the rights of all people to non-discrimination and equality before law. In Article 2, it states that each state party to the present covenant undertakes to respect and to ensure all individuals within its territory and subject to its jurisdiction the rights recognized in the present covenant, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Further, Article 26 states that all persons are equal before law and are entitled without any discrimination to the equal protection of law. In this respect, the law shall prohibit any discrimination and guarantee to all persons equal and effective protection against discrimination on any ground such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. The ICCPR also protects various rights relevant to the protection of sexual minorities, such as right to privacy and right to marry and found a family. It is to be noted here that ICCPR does not specifically refer to sexual minorities. It was in 1994 that the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, the body that interprets the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, held that the term other status in the covenant includes other status based also on sexual orientation. Thus, Article 2 as well as Article 26 directly applicable to sexual minorities also. Since the ICCPR is a binding instrument, the state parties are mandated by the provisions of this instrument. Therefore, in case of any violation of rights of sexual minorities, they can use the provisions of ICCPR for their help. International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. This document also confers the right to non-discrimination. Under Article 2, Subclause 2, it mandates that states that the state party to the present covenant undertakes to guarantee that the rights enunciated in the present covenant will be exercised without discrimination of any kind as to race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. It is to be noted here that like ICCPR, the ICESCR also does not explicitly prohibit discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. However, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has, through its general comments and its concluding observations, expressed concerns over discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. In its general comment, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights states that discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation is prohibited by the other status classification of Article 2, Subclause 2. Thus, it can be seen that other status as recognized in Article 2, Subclause 2 includes sexual orientation. Therefore, sexual minorities can claim protection of various rights mentioned under ICESCR without any discrimination. Human Rights and Sexual Orientation Human Rights Council resolution of 2003 is the next document we should be talking about. This resolution was introduced by Brazil in April 2003 at the 59th session of the United Nations Commission for Human Rights for consideration that called upon both the United Nations and state governments to incorporate protection from persecution and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation into their human rights practices and procedures. The resolution reaffirms that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights affirms the principle of inadmissibility of discrimination and proclaims that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that everyone is entitled to all the rights, freedoms set forth therein in the document without any distinction on any kind. It affirms that express deep concern at the occurrence of violations of human rights in the world against persons on grounds of their sexual orientation. In its expression, it stresses that human rights and fundamental freedoms are the birthright of all human beings, that the universal nature of these rights and freedoms is beyond question, and that the enjoyment of such rights and freedoms should not be hindered in any way on the grounds of sexual orientation. It calls upon all states to promote and protect the human rights of all persons, regardless of their sexual orientation. The resolution notes the attention given to human rights violations on the grounds of sexual orientation by the special procedures in their reports to Commission on Human Rights as well as by the treaty monitoring bodies, and encourages all special procedures of the Commission within their mandates to give due attention to the subject. The resolution also requests the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to pay due attention to the violation of human rights on the grounds of sexual orientation. This resolution was strongly opposed by a number of countries, including the Vatican, Zimbabwe, Pakistan, which was leading the Organization of Islamic Conference, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. At the same time, this resolution has received support from Japan and European Union, along with many Latin American and Central and Eastern European countries. As a result, this resolution failed. Yogyakarta Principles of 2006, as mentioned previously, very important document on the recognition of sexual minorities. These principles on the application of international human rights law in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity were developed in 2006 by a group of international legal experts and adopted in March 2007 in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. This document consists of 29 principles which give detailed understanding about the application of international human rights law to sexual orientation. The most important principle is the Principle 1, which states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Human beings of all sexual orientations and gender identities are entitled to the full enjoyment of all human beings. Another important principle states that everyone is entitled to enjoy all human rights without discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Everyone is entitled to equality before law and equal protection of the law, without any such discrimination whether or not the enjoyment of another human right is also affected. The law shall prohibit any such discrimination and guarantee to all persons equal and effective protection against any such discrimination. Discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity includes any distinction, exclusion, restriction or preference based on sexual orientation or gender identity, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing equality before law or the equal protection of law or the recognition, enjoyment or exercise on an equal basis of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. Discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity may be and commonly is compounded by discrimination on other grounds, including gender, race, age, religion, disability, health, and economic status. Various principles address a broad range of international human rights standards, which are applicable to sexual minorities, that can be summed up as follows: right to universal enjoyment of human rights, non-discrimination and recognition before law, rights to human and personal security, economic, social and cultural rights, rights to expression, opinion and association, freedom of movement and asylum, rights of participation in culture and family life, rights of human rights defenders, and rights of redressal and accountability. The most important feature of these principles is that each principle provides detailed recommendations to states and United Nations, national institutions and the media, including the NGOs, about implementation of various measures for the protection of the rights of sexual minorities. The principles, like other soft law, have no binding force, but they do serve as a guidance to states in their conduct. For example, the Yogyakarta principles were used as the basis for 2008 UN Declaration on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, which was supported by 67 member states. Furthermore, the principles have been cited by a number of states, including members of the Commonwealth, as useful interpretative principles. The New Zealand Human Rights Commission referred to the principles in its November 2007 report, To Be Who I Am, on transgender rights. The High Court of Delhi in India referred to the principles in its judgment in the case of Naz Foundation versus the government of NCT of Delhi and others, given by Justice Shah, striking down Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes homosexuality as unconstitutional. UN Declaration on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity 2008 is our next discussion. The growing international momentum on sexual and gender rights culminated in 2008 UN Declaration on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. It explicitly recognizes sexual orientation and gender identity as legitimate grounds for protection under international human rights law, condemns a range of human rights violations based on sexual orientation and gender identity. This declaration expressly states that the principle of non-discrimination, which requires that human rights apply equally to every human being regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. It states that violence, harassment, discrimination, exclusion, stigmatization and prejudice are directed against persons in all countries in the world because of sexual orientation or gender identity, and that these practices undermine the integrity and dignity of those subjected to these abuses. It condemns the human rights violations based on sexual orientation or gender identity wherever they occur. In particular, the use of death penalty on this ground, extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions, the practice of torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatments or punishments, arbitrary arrests or detentions, and deprivation of economic, social and cultural rights, including the right to health. It further urges states to take all necessary measures, in particular legislative or administrative, to ensure that sexual orientation or gender identity may under no circumstance be the basis for criminal penalties, in particular executions, arrests or detentions. It also states that states to ensure that human rights violations based on sexual orientation or gender identity are investigated and perpetrators held accountable and brought to justice. Declaration of Sexual Rights of the year 2014. This declaration was adopted by the World Association for Sexual Health it was a multidisciplinary worldwide group of scientific societies, NGOs, and professionals in the field of human sexuality, which promotes sexual health throughout the lifespan and through the world by developing promotion and supporting sexology and sexual rights for all. The Declaration contains numerous provisions which directly address the rights of sexual minorities. It states that everyone is entitled to enjoy all sexual rights set forth in the Declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, ethnicity, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, place of residence, property, birth, disability, age, nationality, marital and family status, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, health status, economic and social situation, and any other status. Further, it states that everyone shall be free from torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment related to sexuality, including harmful traditional practices, forced sterilization, contraception or abortion, and other forms of torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment perpetrated for reasons related to someone's sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and bodily diversity. The Declaration also expressly guarantees various rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, the right to autonomy and bodily integrity, right to be free from all forms of violence and coercion, the right to be free from all forms of violence and coercion, the right to enter from and dissolve marriage and other similar types of relationships based on equality and full and free consent, the right to participation in public and political life, and the right to access justice, remedies, and redressal. Though this declaration is not binding instrument, its importance lies in the fact that the declaration expressly includes the term sexual orientation and gender identity, thereby protecting various rights of sexual minorities. Report of the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights: Discrimination and violence against the individuals based on their sexual orientation and gender identity of the year 2014. The report notes that in recent years, governments in all regions have pursued a variety of initiatives aimed at reducing levels of violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. For example, since the year 2011, 14 states have adopted or strengthened anti-discrimination and hate crime laws, extended protection on grounds of sexual orientation and or sexual identity, and in 2 cases also introducing legal protection for intersex persons. 3 states have abolished criminal sanctions for homosexuality, have introduced marriage of civil unions for same-sex couples. The 10 have introduced reforms that to varying degrees make it easier for transgender persons to obtain legal recognition of their gender identity. This report further states that states have well-established obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of all persons within their jurisdiction with no exception, including LGBT and intersex people. These obligations extend to refraining from interference in the enjoyment of rights, prevention of abuses by third party, and proactive tackling barriers to the enjoyment of human rights, including, in the present context, discriminatory attitudes and practices targeted towards sexual minorities or gender identities. The report has also identified the specific obligations of states in relation to protection of rights of sexual minorities. They are to protect individuals from violence, to prevent torture and ill treatment, to decriminalize homosexuality, and to repeal other laws used to punish individuals on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, to protect individuals from discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity, to protect rights of freedom of expression association and assembly, and to take part in the conduct of public affairs. Along with various international instruments, different UN special rapporteurs have also addressed the need for protection of sexual minorities in different matters. For example, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Freedom of Opinion and Expression, the Special Rapporteur on the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the Special Rapporteur on the right to education, the Special Rapporteur on adequate housing as a component of the right to an adequate standard of living, and the Special Rapporteur on the question of torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. How can we conclude now? The module holistically and comprehensively discussed various international instruments concerning the rights of sexual minorities. A key learning for all of you has been the importance of various international treaties and instruments in setting and recognizing the standards of law for human rights and their enforcement. The module effectively touches upon almost all the key treaties and declarations which provide for this framework. I'll repeat these treaties that we've discussed for you. We've discussed UN Charter 1945, UDHR 1948, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights 1966, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights 1966, Human Rights and Sexual Orientation 2003, Human Rights Council Resolution, the Yogyakarta Principles of 2006, UN Declaration on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity of 2008, Declaration of Sexual Rights 2014, Report of the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Discrimination and Violence Against Individuals Based on Their Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, which is the title of this report of the year 2015. I hope you've been introduced well enough to all these treaties and documents. Thank you so much for listening.